and welcome to today's lesson on the role of the federal courts. We're going to be spending a little bit of time over the next few lessons with the judicial branch of government, which is our federal court system. Now, the judicial branch is made up of the Supreme Court. Okay, the Supreme Court is the big one, right up at the top of this pyramid. But there are more than 100 other courts that are federal courts in our federal judicial system. In court, judges can avoid politics of the legislative and executive branches. They're not politicians, not within the federal court system. They are appointees, and their job is to interpret the law. That is, to see how an individual law applies to a specific case or a specific set of cases. This is different from state courts, which are what handle state laws and most local issues. Most courts and most cases go through a local system, not a federal system. Now, laws in the courts. Disputes involving laws are settled in courts. This is what courts exist for, to settle legal disputes. Now, the laws are written by the Congress. Or if we're talking about state laws, we're talking about state legislatures. But the people sometimes disagree on how those laws should be applied to an individual case. So we have a law, but how does it work in this situation? It's illegal to jaywalk. You can't cross the street outside of a crosswalk. But what if you're doing so because you're trying to help somebody who's on the other side of the street? Well, how does the law apply in this case? All right, so what do courts do? The role of courts is to apply laws to individual cases. Hopefully we're setting that into our memories now, and resolve those legal conflicts. Our legal system divides cases into two types. Both of these are important for us to know. We have criminal cases. In a criminal case, we are determining whether someone has broken the law. Okay, there is a law. The person is suspected of having broken it. If they did, how should they be punished in this specific instance? That is a criminal case. But there are also civil cases. Civil cases involve issues such as a broken contract or a divorce, violation of constitutional rights. There's not a specific law that has been violated, and yet something has happened that needs to be resolved. A disagreement over a contract. Let's say my job as a teacher here at Pontiac High School were to change dramatically, and it would be different from my existing contract. And me and Pontiac schools got into some sort of conflict over that. It could go to a civil case. Pontiac, it won't. We're good. Don't worry about it. All right. So parties in a conflict. Some terminology here that we need to know and understand. In civil law, okay, not criminal law, civil law, the people who bring the case to a court, it's called the plaintiff. Okay, so if you are challenging somebody else, it's a civil case, you are the plaintiff, while the accused party is the defendant. Now, defendants in a civil case can be individuals, it can be a group, or it can be the government itself. You can bring a civil case against your local, state, or federal government. Now, in a criminal case, in criminal law, the case is brought by the prosecution. Okay, different term than plaintiff. Plaintiff is just for civil case. Prosecution is just for criminal case. And the prosecution represents the people. Okay, the people is us. It's our society. It's what's right for the good of the whole. And in a criminal case, we want to protect the people against criminal actions. The name of a court case is the defendant's name is listed last. So it would be the people verse, and then you have the defendant. Or in a civil case, you might have Mr. Samuelson versus Pontiac Schools. That's how those work. So you always know who the defendant is. Now, as a court tries to settle a dispute, the judge will listen to the arguments of both sides. Okay? Judge is responsible for listening to the arguments and to direct the trial, to make sure that lawyers are following the right procedures and that everything is happening the way it's supposed to. They guide this case so that both sides can have their arguments heard in a neutral way. Judges don't take sides. Now, many cases are also heard by a jury. The jury is a group of 12 individuals who come together. They're supposed to be the peers of the defendant. Okay, so people who are, drawn from the general public. And they will determine the guilt or innocence of the case. They will determine what should happen. The right to a jury, the right to have a jury decide this case, is guaranteed by the Constitution. However, in certain cases, you can choose to refuse a jury trial and have your case determined by a judge instead. Interpreting the law. Since laws don't deal with individual cases, judges have to interpret the law to determine how it should apply. Central concept here, right? Judges in the court system interpret laws to see how they can apply to individual cases. Laws don't deal with individual cases. Now, in these cases, the decision of a judge may set a precedent for how the law would be interpreted in the future. So judges can look back and say, well, 2 years ago there was a case, it was very similar to this. This was how it was decided. And therefore, I'm going to begin with that frame in mind. This has already been decided. This was already a similar case. Why is this one different? The judge may ask the lawyers. And that's how we establish precedent, and that's how we make court cases in the future a little less complex than they were the first time around. All right, state courts and federal courts. Important to know this. State courts and federal courts. State courts and federal courts. We have both. The highest courts in our country are federal courts. Okay, they're the top dogs. The federal courts are most important. That was set forward in the U.S. Constitution under the Supremacy Clause, that federal systems would take precedence or supremacy over state systems. And it's here in these federal courts that the most important precedents are set. However, most courts operate on the state and local level. If you go to court, most likely you are going to a state or a local court. Okay, you're going to traffic court, or you robbed your next door neighbor. Shame on you. You shouldn't have done that. But robbery is a state crime. It is not a federal crime. You go to a state court. Now, cities and states each have their own laws. Far more laws than the federal government does. So most legal disputes are settled in those state courts. Homicide, murder, that is a state crime, and you would go to a state court for it. Jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is a fancy word for basically who has the right to hear a case. The court which first hears a civil or criminal case is the court of, quote, original jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction is the court that had the right to hear the case first. This court determines the facts of the case by holding a trial. So they're also called trial courts sometimes. And if a plaintiff or a defendant disagrees with that court decision, that is, they went through the whole process, judges, lawyers, etc., and the defendant doesn't like the result, well, they can appeal. They can appeal that decision. And try to get another court to hear that case. That's plaintiffs or defendants in a criminal case. You cannot appeal if you are the prosecution. If somebody is found innocent of a crime, you cannot charge them with that crime again and get another court case. So plaintiffs or defendants in civil cases, just defendants in criminal cases. All right, appellate courts. So your appeal has been filed and accepted. There's reason for you to have a retrial. The appellate courts have this appellate jurisdiction. They will only hear appeals. They don't hold original trials. They don't determine the facts of a case. They're only going to look at how that case was carried out. Was it carried out effectively and correctly? And if it wasn't, well, we'll move forward and see what we should do about it. Appellate courts determine whether the law was properly applied by the lower court. Did they do it correctly? Now, appellate court decisions can be further appealed, but now you got to go to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court is the final court of appeal. Now, most cases, again, are heard by state courts. Federal courts are limited to two kinds of cases. Federal courts are only going to hear ones involving federal law, or which are beyond the authority of the states. And we'll get more into that in a future lesson. The second thing that they'll hear are cases appealed from state Supreme Courts. So if you go all the way through a state court system and the state Supreme Court rules against you, you can still appeal. But now you got to appeal to the United States Supreme Court. And that is our court system in a nutshell. We'll get more into the specifics next time. I hope you learned something today, and farewell.